Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today, after 5 months of saying that the next one will be coming soon, it is finally time to actually do the next full Elites tier list updated to covert operations. Now, if you know at what point I'm recording this and releasing this, of course you know that we have had another expansion since then, Blood and Iron, but because when I started this updated series, it was with covert operations, I'm going to continue rating just the elites from covert operations, but I did a separate Blood and Iron's elites tier list where I would put them, so you can reference that if you're wondering where I would put them there. But because I've already done that, I'm just going to stick to the elites I have not covered recently, and that is all of the other elites in the game, including those in the reserved pool. And again, to be clear, this is not a crafting guide. If you want a crafting guide, if you want ideas of what elites you should craft for any given nation, that depends on a lot of things, like what you're having, what types of decks you like to play, and of course it is going to change substantially between expansions, between metas, between balance patches. So just because something is the best, it might mean that it's going to be on the chopping block, or the deck that is built around is going to be on the chopping block, or maybe it's going to be rotated next expansion, or maybe it's really, really good in a deck that you need a ton of other elites to make work, and if you have a small collection, you should focus on another elite, which will have more of an impact on a small collection. So anyways, all that to be said, this is not a crafting guide. Do not simply craft the cards in order that I list them here. Also, I am one person. This is my opinion. Other people might disagree with me on the value of certain elites. And I know there's been some discussion on my Blood and Iron elites. And I just want to say that the way I'm doing these lists is not what I think the best elites are right now, as in what is most impactful in the meta, in the game, at this exact moment. That is not what I am listing here. And, you know, if you want, you can ask me and I'll give you my thoughts on what those would be. And, of course, other people will already have content like that out there that you can find. This is what I think is more of the card itself and in its place relative to the cards that exist in the game more broadly, and where I see support going in the future. So some of these, you might be like, well, that's like a good card, but like, you know, that's not in the best deck in the game right now. And that's because, well, like, maybe there's something broken in the game right now, but that'll probably be nerfed. But this elite is insane in a very specific deck that at this exact moment isn't seeing a lot of play. Something like that. So yeah, just in case you're wondering why I've put things that you're like, well, nobody's playing that right now high on the list. That's why, because I think people either were playing it a lot before, and I think will play it in the future, or maybe they haven't played it yet, but I think they will play it in the future. And like sometimes it's just cards that like drastically limit design space, and maybe nobody actually ends up playing it in the future, but that's because they had to design the game around this card existing. So that's why it's still in the strictly broken category, even if it doesn't necessarily make its way into, you know, the top tier meta decks at any given point, really. But all of that to be said, I'm also not going to go through my descriptions here on what S, A, B, C, D mean to me in this context. Oh, that completely broke. There we go. But you can reference previous videos, and it's pretty self-explanatory on the side here. Of course, the distinction between B and C is going to be always kind of arbitrary. But with that all being said, let's jump into the actual tier list. So let's roll the intro and get to the first card.
What a performance there by J King.
J King, full plot armor.
J King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J King is our world champion! J King 7! What? The back-to-back Cards world champion!
Alright, first time I've remembered to roll the intro in a while. But first card up here we have, fittingly, is First Rifles. So First Rifles is a absolutely cracked card that was rotated in the first set of rotations, if I recall correctly. And First Rifles is a very interesting card because it's gone through a couple, well, one major change. So First Rifles used to say, shuffle 2 First Rifles into your deck. It's a 4-cost 3/5 guard infantry. And it used to just be a 4-cost 3/5 guard infantry that would put 2 4-cost 3/5 guard infantries in your deck, and those would each put 2 into the deck if you found them and they died. And that would allow you to go infinite, but it would be infinitely drawing a 3/5 infantry with guard that doesn't do anything else. And sometimes that would be really, really good, because you would just manage to outvalue your opponent, and then you would never run out of cards in your deck, and you would never take fatigue. And sometimes that would be really bad, because you would want to draw the higher impact cards of your deck, or you want to draw your card draw, or you want to draw your AoEs, or you want to draw your big units, and instead you just keep drawing 3-5 infantries that if you play it will make it then even harder in the future to draw the cards that you want, and eventually you lose because of this card. So it wasn't like an insane card, but it was an interesting place. But it pushed a playstyle that they didn't really like, so they decided, well, how do we change this card? Well, what if we just say Destruction summons second rifles? First rifle summons second rifles, and, you know, maybe people will play it. So it's still a 4-cost 3-5 infantry, but now, instead of Destruction shuffled some cards into your deck that may or may not make your deck better, they changed it to Destruction summon a 3-4 guard that has additional text that's not really relevant. But as it turns out, a 4-cost 3-5 guard that, when it's destroyed, summons a 3-4 guard in a game that didn't have Suppress yet. It didn't have almost 0 ways to get around destruction effects or get around guard, meant that this was essentially a 3-9 guard, but it's even better than a 3-9 guard because if you do something like amphibious assault on it, it's invulnerable to like half of that because it doesn't just simply die like a 3-9 guard would, it comes back as a 3-4 guard. Things like amphibious assault are limited to how much of the damage it can hit. It's basically like a 3-9 guard that takes 2 hits to kill from orders, and that's absolutely insane. Basically, you would just play first rifles on turn 4. You'd play it as soon as you possibly could, but if you played it on turn 4, your chances of winning the game went up. And that's true about all good Soviet elites. Soviets have a national identity when it comes to game design and cards that seems to just be give them insanely broken elites and mediocre everything else. And then, you know, if their elites are better than the best things you can do in other nations, Soviets are good, and if the elites are not good enough to handle what people are doing in other nations, then Soviets are bad. And for a long time, First Rifles was better than anything you could do in other nations. That's going up into an easy S tier. That card is arguably one of the greatest elites of all time, despite being just a very, very simple text. Then we have 272nd Guards, and 272nd is an interesting card because when it was announced, I feel like people kind of slept on this card. So what this card is, in case people don't know, because I actually don't know if it's rotated or not, or if it's just the cards that people played it for got rotated. But you probably haven't seen it if you've only been playing cards recently. And the 272nd is an 8-cost 6-6 guard infantry destruction, very similar to the First Rifles. But instead of summoning a 3-4 guard infantry, the 272nd summons the Yosef Stalin. And that's a card that we're going to be looking at a little down the line here. But it's an 8-8 heavy armor 2 tank. So essentially, 272nd Guards is a 6-6 infantry with guard for 8 is not good. And this came out before Suppress. Obviously, we are now raiding it in a world where Suppress is still a thing. Whereas First Rifles, it's, you know, if you can play it down on turn 4, they aren't guaranteed to have Suppress, and even if they do have Suppress, it's probably going to throw off their curve a little bit. And then you're still left with, you played a 3-5 infantry that needed to be responded by one of your opponent's best tools on curve, and you're fine if First Rifles get Suppressed. Like, obviously, Suppress existing brings the power level slightly down than what it used to be, but it's still an S tier card. 272nd in a world where Suppress exists is a lot worse, because your opponent, it has to come to turn 8, and if your opponent knows you're playing Soviet control, you know 272nd is the best target of Suppress in the entire deck. So the odds are that by turn 8, they will have that card, any Suppress they have, in their hand when you play it, and if they don't, they will keep it alive for as long as possible until they draw it. Now, obviously, there's ways to get around that, like destroying your own 272nd the turn you play it, with cards like Red Banner, and then you get 2 Stalins. But that's kind of inconsistent. It makes it more expensive. It requires 2 elites. Well, obviously, you can do something like stand together now and get the tank, and then the T, I think it's a T-34, it's a T something. But you get the 2 tanks. But again, it's using 2 cards, and then you can't really attack with it unless you have additional credits. And then at that point, like, do you really want to spend 2 cards to get 2 big things when one of the cards kind of doesn't do anything on its own, and the other card is very vulnerable on its own? Why wouldn't you just run 2 cards that don't require other synergies? Like, why wouldn't you just run the Stalin on its own at that point? If you're going to have to put so much effort into killing the 272nd on your own turn. So the 272nd, my point is, it has dropped off drastically from when it came out. And when it came out, I don't think people were too excited with it, and then they started playing around with it, and they realized it's just an insane top end for a Soviet-controlled deck to do, because you have to get through so many other threats, and then eventually, every Soviet-controlled deck was going to do 272nd Red Banner, get 2 Stalins on the board, and you had to be able to answer that, and there were not a lot of ways to answer that in every nation. And, if you're playing against, like, Japan, for example, they have To the Last Man, you'd basically just keep playing the game until they have to play To the Last Man, and then the second they play To the Last Man, you do 272nd Red Banner, you win the game. Because they just simply can't remove 2 massive threats in a row. There's a lot more ways to do that, and also there's Suppress. So I think 272nd is a card that is not going to shine as much. Is it enough to put it down into B tier? Honestly, I think so. Just realistically speaking, 272nd is not a cornerstone of Soviet control anymore. You absolutely can build Soviet control with 272nd. You can also build it without. And I both mean in terms of, like, just standard, quote-unquote, Soviet control, but also, like, even if you're playing in classic mode, where you have all of the cards that have been reserved, 272nd I still don't think makes the cut. I think it probably makes the cut even less. Even if you do have access to Red Banner. So 272nd, it's going down to B tier, but man, this card was a wild ride in the first meta it came out. Now, a Soviet elite which has not aged as poorly as 272nd is the 39th Rifles. This card came out with World at War. It's a 5-cost, 5/5 infantry deployment. Take control of an enemy unit with 2 cost or less. So, you know how I said First Rifles was, you play First Rifles on turn 4 and you probably win the game. If you play 39th Rifles on turn 5, you also probably win the game. And if you played First Rifles on turn 4 into 39th Rifles on turn 5, you have most certainly won the game. And that is sort of the Soviet experience of playing against Soviet control. The 39th Rifles is such a key card in certain matchups because Soviets can sometimes struggle into certain strategies. They've gotten more AoEs and non-conditional AoEs, so big boards no longer are much of a worry. Obviously, they have Sickle, so early game small health units have never been an issue. And against certain decks like Frontline or Heinz, where it's higher health units that can be quite aggressive, usually you can just slam down enough guards to not really have to worry about Blitzkriegs ending the game too quickly, because the Blitzkriegs will have to trade into your incredibly high health guard units first. But the one big deck that has always been a pain in the side of any Soviet-controlled player is Britain Air, and that's because Soviets have almost no good ways of dealing with air units. But the one good thing about Britain Air is all of the air units that they are playing and buffing are 1 or 2 cost units. And normally for the air player, that's very, very good. You can get them down for cheap, you can get them down early, and then you can start buffing them up a lot. 39th Rifles can steal any air unit from Britain Air. And that's, like, any that they're regularly playing in the deck, obviously. The importance of this card cannot be understated. If you're playing against Britain, and even if you're not confident it's air, even if you think there's a chance it's air, if it's like a 30% chance it's air, you keep 39th Rifles 100% of the time. It's just that crucial in the matchup. Sometimes it is literally the only difference between winning and losing a game against air. And so obviously sometimes you can still lose without 39th Rifles. Very, very rarely can you win without 39th Rifles against Brit Air, and Brit Air just being a constant staple in the meta. It's also obviously incredibly good against other decks. You can steal commandos, you can steal units from Jagro, and because they have 0 op, you can trade them out quite easily. You can steal buffed up units from certain decks like Throp. Throp has a lot of low-cost units that are very crucial for the deck. 39th Rifles is just an absolutely insane card. Obviously, it's been rotated for very good reason, like First Rifles. I hope it doesn't come back, because it really just puts the entire game around, do you draw 39th Rifles? And if so, when do you draw it in the game? And that's just not that fun. This card is absolutely insane. This card could be a 3/3 rather than a 5/5, and it would still see play, and I would probably still even put it into S tier. Maybe it's down to A tier at a 3/3, but it's a 5/5. It is a good statted unit on curve, with also one of the most powerful effects in the game. It is better than First Rifles. We are putting that as, this is probably one of the best elites in the game ever printed. and nothing in the game so far has made that less true. Then we have 6th Airborne, and 6th Airborne is just kind of a weird, clunky card. It's a very, very big infantry. It's a 6-cost, 6/8 infantry that summons a T-34, and unfortunately for the T-34 decks, this card has been rotated, so I don't know of any classic players out there tried out the T-34 new tribal stuff with the 6th Airborne, but the fact that T-34 doesn't see play with in Standard, I can promise you it's not going to be seen play in Classic with 6th Airborne, because even if 6th Airborne was in Standard, you would not be playing this in T-34s, even if you were playing T-34s. Of course, sometimes you can just run it in a heavier Soviet control deck, because a 6-cost, 6/8 infantry that gives you a 5/5 tank that can attack immediately, it can act like removal, is pretty good. The unfortunate part of this card is that it's just very expensive to use it, because you play it for 6, and then if you play it on 6 or 7 credits, you literally just do nothing. You just played a 6-cost, 6/8 vanilla infantry. And if you play it on 8 credits, you can attack something in the front line, but then you can't, like, upgrade or Red Banner or Ural Factories the tank afterwards. Or you can do that, but then you can't attack. And then 10 credits, you can attack the front line, and then Ural Factory it or push it up, and then Ural Factory it or you push it up and attack the support line. But then you need 12 credits. You need to reach the max credits and then use all of them to play this card, move and attack with the tank, and then keep the tank alive and turn it into a body. And that's something that you would want to do with this card to be using it effectively. And that is just really, really expensive for something which turns out to be not that good. It's like substantially worse than just playing 2 72nd guards stand together. And yeah, this card is unfortunately just far too expensive. It's not played back in the day, and actually to the point where it kind of had to be nerfed, because you would basically be able to consistently reduce its cost and play it for 2 credits, and then when you play this for 2 credits on, say, like turn 4, and then you turn the tank into, you know, something big and scary, that's a lot better. Unfortunately, that is not the world we live in, and I don't even think I can put it in C tier. I think I have to put it, well, no, I'm going to put it into C tier. D tier is dedicated, I feel like, for cards which you wouldn't even want in draft. Like, cards that are just, like, actively make your deck worse. Because the 6th Airborne, it's a really slow card, it's a really heavy card. I don't see a world where any possible meta, without just, like, insane synergy cards that don't exist in the game, get printed in the future that have synergy with this card. But just everything in the game now, I can't imagine a world where you would ever really want to put this card in your deck. But if you're just, like, playing draft and you see this card versus some other options, like the Beriev or something, you know, you can take a 6th Airborne. It's a fine. A 6-cost, 6/8 infantry is not bad. It has upside. If you're a low collection player and this is one of your only elites, definitely just throw it in your deck. It might even win you some games sometimes. It's just a really big guy. So I don't know if I can really put it into terrible, but it's absolutely not making it into any cutting-edge decks. Then we have the Cuban Cossacks. This is an interesting card which has gone back and forth in what decks people play it in, how much people like it, how well do people rate it. Despite the card not really ever seen any meaningful changes, I don't think this card has ever been changed, at least for as long as I've been playing the game. And it's a very simple card. It's a 3-cost, 3/3 infantry with Blitz, 0 operation cost, and then very interestingly, Smokescreen. And I love this little just flavor with the card, because when you play it, obviously 99.99999% of the time you're going to play it and then you're going to use the Blitz. Whether that's to attack something or push to the front line, it doesn't matter, but either way it will remove the Smokescreen, and then it didn't matter that the card had Smokescreen. And obviously you could try to play this in some Soviet main Smokescreen synergy deck, but that's silly. The main thing that you use Cossacks for is sometimes you don't want to attack with it right away, but you do want to use your credits. So say you're a control deck and your opponent is playing something where they're going to be pushing up units into the front line, and you don't want to give them a free value trade by playing Cossacks and pushing it up in the front line immediately, and then giving them the best choice of trading it out. So instead, you play Cossacks, and then you pass with it, and it sits in your support line with Smokescreen. Your opponent can't interact with it very easily, and then the next turn, if your opponent has to take up the front line, the next turn you get to control the trades, but you no longer have to spend the 3 credits on it because you spent the 3 credits on it the previous turn. It does not come up very often, but I really like the flavor of this card. And it is just kind of a flexible card. Now, it's been insane in the past because you used to be able to play this on turn 1, and playing cards that cost 3 on turn 1 are generally good, especially when that card is 0 operation cost, so you can get it to the front line on turn 1, and then you have basically just immediately won the game against decks like Britain Air if you went first, and against Frontline if you went first or second. And yeah, just turn 1 Cossacks was very, very good. You can no longer do turn 1 Cossacks, well, at least very easily. And since then, it's obviously the deck that it was most played in artillery has fallen off the face of the earth. However, people have started running it more and more in Soviet control just because it's a fine unit. It's not anything flashy, it's not anything good, it's definitely not an auto-include card, but it's just simply good enough as a largely vanilla unit, and I would actually put it over 272nd Guards. Obviously, 272nd Guards is going to have a much bigger impact, or at least it's going to be easier to see the huge impact of a 272nd on any given game, but the Cossacks is a card that's, like, never terrible. It always does something at any stage in the game, whether it's blocking the front line or just 3 credits to deal 3 damage to something in the front line. Or maybe you just use it to spend credits. It baits out removal, it baits out a board clear. Cossacks is just sort of never that bad, because 3 credits is a very nice point where you could very easily fit it into a lot of turns later in the game without drastically throwing off the turn as a whole. Just because 3, it's a low enough number. At 4, you're already reaching a lot of breaking points where you can't do a lot of things that you want to do in the same turn and play a random 4-cost card. With a 3-cost card, you can really fit it in easily. I'm a huge fan of Cossacks, but obviously it's not going up into A tier. Then we have the Engineers Battalion, so Soviet's version of the 0-4 Elite, and the Engineers Battalion, I'm sure you all know what it does. It says whenever a friendly unit dies, get +2 health to your HQ. And sometimes you draw this on turn 12, and it heals like 2 or 4. Sometimes it heals nothing because your opponent removes it immediately. And sometimes you play this on turn 1 and it heals you 40 health over the course of the game. And, you know, it's like starting the game on 60, and, you know, you might end the game on 10, but that 50 or that 40 extra health really, really helped out in winning the game, obviously. So it's a card that single-handedly wins you games sometimes, with Suppress being in the game, and this really, I think Soviets got hit the hardest by Suppress being added as a mechanic. But with Suppress in the game, Engineers has dropped off a lot in its power level. That being said, it used to be one of the best cards in the game, so a drop-off in power level from the top is still going to be quite high because it's still a very, very good card. It forces your opponent into suppression, and the interesting thing about Soviet control is the fact that you sort of reach a critical mass of just most targets in your deck are really good to suppress, and most decks in the meta are not running like 8 cards to suppress, or like 8 suppress cards in their deck. Now, obviously, there's certain things like White Death or the B-24J, where they're going to be able to suppress multiple things, and you're going to have to play around that to a certain extent. But if you're just playing against something like Frontline, where they have, like, you know, maybe a Duress and, like, 3 M4A1s at most, or not M4A1, M10s, so, like, at most they're going to have, like, 4 ways to suppress units, and they're all single target. If they suppress an Engineers and it only healed you 2, or maybe it didn't heal you anything at all, you're not feeling that bad, because you're just going to, like, slam down an Armored Train the next turn, and now they don't have suppress for that, and now you're going to win the game. So Engineers, I would still put it as a S tier card. It is just an absolutely insane way to get healing that is really unrivaled in the game, basically since back when Honey had Smokescreen. Just the fact that if your opponent doesn't have a way to deal with this, and there's some decks and some nations that just don't have an easy way of dealing with this, it is going to be insane, and all of the ways you can deal with it is with cards that will also be good into Soviets. So it's not like it's, you know, it would be very different if, like, everybody was playing Flampanzer and this was the only 1-cost card in your deck, and then it's like, okay, well, that falls off quite heavily, because there's a very decent chance that they'll have a Flampanzer and there's nothing else that's targeting. But, like, if your opponent has to suppress it, or if your opponent has to hammer it, or if your opponent has to, like, drop a wave after wave on a relatively small board to take it out, you're not upset as the Soviet player. And also, if you take it out with an AoE, the fact that it still heals you with everything else that dies, it makes it incredibly strong against stuff like Desperate Measures. Trying to use it to take it out. Japan, in particular, has a very tough time getting rid of this card. And, you know, that's a deck where you definitely want this card against, because, you know, if you play this card against turn 1, against an aggro deck on turn 1, you're probably going to win. Now we have Great Patriotic War, and this is a very difficult card to rate. I also realize that this is the old tier list, and the picture I used for it at the time is the gold picture, because I didn't have a non-gold copy of Great Patriotic War for the screenshot. But anyways, Great Patriotic War is a 6-cost order that sets the defense of both HQs to 12. And it was not always this. It used to be a very, very bad card that nobody played, and then they turned it into the current version, and then suddenly it was a card that everybody played. Because as it turns out, 6 costs set your opponent to 12 health is a very, very good card if you can then use your 6 remaining credits to deal 12 damage. Because then you can kill them in one turn, regardless of what their starting health was at the start of the turn, and that was something that was very, very revolutionary for people trying to play OTK in Cards, because this was changed at sort of the height of Mare Nostrum, and there was still a lot of honey in the meta. There was a lot of France ally for triple call to the colonies in the meta. So, you know, a lot of decks, basically every control deck, had the ability to quite comfortably heal for at least 20 to 30 in every game, and OTK decks could not comfortably deal 50 damage early on in the game, but Great Patriotic War came out, and just, like, it led to a completely new age of OTK decks in Cards, and you know, a lot of them were nerfed, and then just new ways of dealing that 12 damage with Great Patriotic War kept coming and coming and coming. And then finally, I believe Great Patriotic War is rotated. Don't quote me on that. I have a really bad memory of what is and isn't rotated for some reason. But at the very least, they nerfed... No, they most certainly rotated Great Patriotic War, and then they also nerfed Push on top of that. So obviously, in the meta right now, nobody is playing Great Patriotic War. However, we're not talking about how good it is in the meta, we're talking about how good it is as a card, and I hope this card never comes back, because as you add more and more cards to the game, it's just simply going to be easier to deal 12 damage with 6 credits. And it's going to take fewer and fewer cards, it's going to need fewer and fewer additional credits, and you're going to have better and better ways to stall to that win condition, you're going to have better ways to draw or fetch that win condition. A card like Great Patriotic War, where it is just so uncounterable. If it's not randomly discarded, and if your opponent doesn't just have, like, Lure and Ultra and Doubting System up, you're just going to die to this card. There's not a lot of ways to get around that. I don't like this card from a design perspective. I don't like this card from just playing against it as a player. And I think that this card probably does belong in S tier, just because this card will only get better with time if it is never changed, and I hope it never comes back. That being said, it is very different than the other S-tier cards in here, because the first 3 are cards you could arguably put into basically every single Soviet deck ever made, and when you draw them, they will almost always be immediately impactful. Great Patriotic War is the exact opposite. You have to put it into a hyper-specific deck, and most of the time when you draw it, it's just going to be a dead card in your hand up until the point where you win. However, it's a card that basically says win the game if X criteria is met. And cards that say win the game if blank generally only get better with time. So we're going to put it up here in S tier, but I am going to leave it on the lower end of S tier just because it is not as widely applicable as the other cards up here. Then we have Heroes of the Soviet Union. The Soviets choose one of 3 Soviet elite units, so it's basically just develop a Soviet elite. And this used to be the best of the choose one of 3 elite cards in the game by a wide margin. So every nation has one of these. Soviets was the best by a wide margin, and it still is. But that was just because, as we've been talking about, Soviets have by far the best elites in the game, and really, there was, at various points of people playing this, there was really only, like, 2 bad elites, so you were always guaranteed an elite that you were happy playing in your deck to begin with, and sometimes you would get a second copy of a win-the-game-on-the-spot elite. So Heroes of the Soviet Union was a staple in Soviet control up until sort of this new age of cards expansions, and it's dropped off a lot since then because a lot more elite units have been introduced, and not all of them have been stellar, or some of them just require hyper-specific decks to be played in. Also, just the game has gotten a lot more faster, and Soviet control in particular is no longer looking for that infinite value train, especially with the introduction of the front formation, which now just gives you infinite value. You don't need a card like Heroes of the Soviet Union anymore for just an extra body to get across the finish line against another control deck. So unfortunately, this card has dropped off the face of the earth, and it is also a card that is only going to get worse as more expansions come out, because it will just get less and less consistent. So I still believe that it is very easily the best of the choose one of 3 elites. The second best was Germany. The other 3 were not even close. And since then, Germany has consistently gotten much worse elites than Soviets have, or elite units at least. So yeah, it is not. I probably would have used to put it in A tier, maybe B tier. Nowadays, I would put it down here in, well, it's high C or low B. It's a little hard to say. Like, it's definitely a card where if you have it, I would play it almost up to the point of a full collection, unless you're like dedicating your collection towards building like authentic card-for-card meta Soviet control. It's always just going to be a fine card to put in your deck, because it's going to let you get cards that you might not own in your collection. And that's always going to be fine. Playing it in standard is going to be weird, because it's only going to be able to get you elites that are currently in standard, and, obviously the best Soviet elites, if we look at the tier list, 1st Rifles and 39th Rifles are not in standard anymore, so you can't get them off of Heroes of the Soviet Union anymore. So with that being said, I do think I would put it down into high C tier. Truly a fall from grace. Probably the largest difference, the largest a card has fallen without being changed in any way, and without the deck around it being nerfed in any substantial way. Then we have the Yosef Stalin. It is the 10-cost 8/8 tank that people have seen a lot of out of 270 and very little of just played by itself. It has the text that if it leaves the board for any reason, add a copy of it to the board. So essentially it can't be retreated. And on top of that, if it is retreated, it's even worse, because you still get it back into your hand, so it basically duplicates itself. It just adds a copy of it into your hand instead of being retreated, if it is ever retreated. So it is a counter to one of the more common ways of getting rid of units, as well as there's a few ways to retreat it yourself to just generate more Stalins. But all of that being said, is just summoning a lot of big tanks for a lot of credits is not a particularly efficient way to win the game anymore. Or really ever. So yeah, Yosef Stalin is probably the least remarkable. It's down there with 6th Airborne in terms of how irremarkable it is as a standalone card. It really exists in the game to get things like Red Banner or upgrade to turn things into the Stalin, or get it off 272nd, but as a standalone card, this card is bad. It is better than the 6th Airborne by a pretty wide amount, and honestly, I'd probably say it's better than Heroes of the Soviet Union, because at least it's a card that I don't think is ever going to be good enough to be played in the meta, unless the meta is just super, super retreat heavy. And just playing this is just an immediate silver bullet to, like, the best deck in the game. But beyond it being a silver bullet, which I think is possible, it's not really ever going to be that great of a card, but at least it does something against certain decks, whereas Heroes of the Soviet Union is just, like, a card that's going to have wildly different impacts and across the games, regardless of what deck you're playing against, because sometimes you're just gonna get bad cards off of it. Whereas the Stalin it's a big card, and sometimes you win games by just playing a big card. Sometimes it's going to counter what your opponent's trying to do. Sometimes it's just going to be a big guy that wins you a game. So we're gonna put it down here, higher end of C tier. Then we have ISU, which is the Soviet Unit Board Clear. This is what we were doing back in the game before Depths of Winter was released and before Strategic Focus was released. ISU says destroy all friendly, or sorry, not all friendly. It says destroy all damaged units, and you would play Winter Warfare to damage all units, and then you'd slam down ISU and pray that they didn't have a way to block your deployment effect, and then you would watch everything on the board die, friendly and enemy units. And that is what people did. It cost 10 credits, because this costs 9, Winter Warfare costs 1. It was very, very inefficient, but it was the top end of a Soviet control deck as just, not even like a top-end unit. As itself, sometimes you could win a game with an ISU, but, sometimes it just gets hit by like a tactical strike or something. But just having an extra full board clear in a control deck was really, really good. Now, its play rate has dropped through the floor because of cards like Strategic Focus and Depths of Winter just giving Soviets much cheaper and easier and more consistent board clears that don't require you to run an additional card, which just is a card that you don't really want to run in your deck, Winter Warfare, because it's just so low impact a lot of the time. That being said, the effect of ISU is still very powerful, so if there's ever ways to reduce its cost, or there's more meta ways of dealing 1 damage to everything, it could come back. Having a card that says destroy all blank units is going to be never a terrible card, because there's going to be times where you want to destroy all units. And this card lets you destroy all units. So I'm going to leave it down here in B tier. It's a card that's not really seen a lot of play now, and I wouldn't put it into any decks now unless the deck already ran a lot of ways to damage a lot of units, or I just needed an extra board clear. But where in B tier does it rank? I would put it slightly above 272nd, just because I do think the ability to destroy all units from your hand is going to be a much more evergreen effect than the ability to summon a big tank if the unit dies. Then we have the KV-1 1942 or 1939. One of them. We have the KV, or actually might be the KV-2. Anyways, we have the KV. That's what people call it. Don't flame me in the comments for not knowing which tank this is. And this is just one of the, in my mind, honestly, it's one of the most iconic elites in Cards, where it's just like, it's just a really good card. It's not flashy, it's medium cost, it's run in every single Soviet deck, but it's not as frustrating as something like an Engineers or like a First Rifles. It's just a very, very fair elite. It's probably like the most fair elite in the game. So it's a 6-cost, 3/6 heavy armor 1 tank that says it deals 2 damage to the enemy every time they draw a card. And you just play this card, you end your turn, they draw a card at the start of their turn, and they take 2 damage. So it basically says deal 2 damage to them. Almost as a deployment effect, and then if they can't destroy it, then they have to try to draw more cards to find more resources to try to destroy it. That's just going to continue killing them. And sometimes you play this card and they can't get rid of it, and it just single-handedly wins you the game. It does 10 damage, or 20 damage. They can't remove it for a 10-card draw, and, you know, even if it starts to attack as its own body, it's a 3/6 heavy armor 1 tank. Not bad. But not amazing. It's just a very good card. Now, there's obviously ways to use this with forced draw, with something like a Phony War, or a Honor and Loyalty, and people have tried to do that. That's never been the most meta way of using this card. You just ran this card in Soviet aggro decks, you ran this card in Soviet tank decks, you ran this card in Soviet control decks. It was just a card that you ran. And, you know, sometimes on ladder you would have 0 cards in hand, and then your opponent would play a KV, and then they'd play Phony War, and then you take 18 damage. And it's hilarious when that happens to you, because you're like, honestly, good for you. So, KV, I think, is going to be our first A-tier card, because it's just really, really good. It's difficult to imagine a world where this is never a consideration. You'd have to really get crazy with the power creeping for this to never be a consideration. There's definitely worlds where maybe you're just not playing Soviets, or the best Soviets deck, maybe this just doesn't make the cut quite enough. But for the most part, I think it is much better than all of the elites down in B tier, and it's much less impactful on the game as a whole than all of the cards up in S tier. There's honestly there should be a S+, and then all of these should be an S+, and then an empty S tier, and then KV and A tier, but I'm not going to add an additional thing, just to get across how powerful these cards at the top are. Then we have Minority Recruits, which, oh boy, this card was just never good. It was announced, and some people were like, wow, that's a really powerful effect. It's Mind Control from Hearthstone. It's a 10-cost order that says take control of the enemy unit. And yeah, they showed this card off, and people were like, wow, like your opponent plays a B-17, and then you steal the B-17. That's a crazy card. The issue is you have to get to 10 credits, and most units have a very powerful deployment effect, and are less like you win the game on its own by existing on the board. And even if those did, at the time when this came out, the best units that would win the game single-handedly on their own, all said cannot be targeted by orders. So why would you play Minority Recruits in your deck? Every once in a while you might get blown out by this card, you know, on ladder, but like, Nobody ever played this card seriously, and then they released Partisans, like the next expansion, and that basically just said 6 cost take control of an enemy unit, which is a lot better than 10 cost take control of an enemy unit, and also Partisans was not an elite. So yeah, Minority Recruits is bad. This putting it down here in terrible, like, there's times if you're just playing an ultra grindy Soviet control deck that, like, maybe you want this. It's probably best in the mirror, because Soviets have the least impactful deployment effects across the board, I say, despite the top card being 39th Rifles. But as a whole, Soviet elites do tend to be a bit more value on the board rather than immediate impact tempo. So if there's a weird world where it's a Soviet-controlled mirrors and you got a Minority Recruits, they're 272nd or something, like, maybe. It's probably never going to happen, but, I'll leave it down here in C tier, just because there are some truly terrible elites. Then we have Monastyr, and Monastyr is a very funny card. There's a very funny copy pasta, unique cards copy pasta that came about because of Monastyr, and this is because Monastyr has a quite deceptive card tech. So Monastyr is a 5-cost order that says destroy all enemy units and replace them with units that cost 1 less. And actually, I'm going to quickly check if that's what the card says, because I don't know if I've ever played the card. I, at the very least, have not seen this card played in like 3 years, and I was figured that this might happen. So yeah, it says destroy and replace every enemy unit with a unit of the same nation, costing 1 less if possible. Now, this is a very disruptive tool. If your opponent is playing a deck that likes to buff up a lot of cards, or it has some synergies, like something like Alpine, then Monastyr is very, very good at disrupting that, particularly something like Brit Air. And that was sort of the worry that people had, is they were like, oh, the only thing keeping Soviet control in check is Britain Air. And if you add Monastyr, suddenly they destroy Britain Air, because all of those 1-cost air units get turned into the 0-cost infantry. And then Brit Air sucks. And now they don't have air units for their close air supports. And Monastyr destroys the game, and it only costs 5. Are you kidding? And yeah, the issue with Monastyr is, one, crucially, it does not say replace enemy units with ones that cost less. It says destroy and then replace, so it will trigger all destruction effects. It will trigger things like Signal Regiment or Engineers, because everything gets destroyed, and then you summon a bunch of new units. Also, if there does not exist a unit that costs 1 less from the same nation, it doesn't destroy it. So, particularly, this was an issue with Alpine, because there's no 0-cost Italian unit, so the 1-cost Alpines would turn into nothing, and then all of the 2-cost Alpines would turn into the 1-cost Alpine, and all of the 3-cost Alpines would turn into the 2-cost Alpines, and then you didn't really accomplish a whole lot of anything. So, it didn't really work. There's also no 0-cost Japanese units, so all of the Japanese 1-drops just stay on the board. Yeah, Monastyr some people thought this card was going to be insane, and it sucked. It was terrible. Now, I will say, this card does get better as time goes on, because the units at every cost fill out as more cards get printed. So this, as more nations get 0-cost units, this gets better against 1-cost units. And as more nations get, there's a lot more high-cost, low-stat units for a lot more nations because of their deployment effects. And that tends to happen across, like, as a general rule, as games go on and power creep happens. So I honestly do think Monastyr does get better with time. The issue is I believe Monastyr is rotated, and I don't think it's ever coming back, because nobody's particularly interested in this card. If it does come back, I imagine it's going to come back with a massive rework, or, like, maybe a massive cost reduction, because, like, at 5, this card still is very, very expensive. So I could see it, like, come back costing 3, I could see it being reworked entirely, I could see this card never coming back and just being a dead card. However, I do think in its current form, at 5, it's not a D tier card. I don't think I would put this into terrible. I think people overestimate how bad this card is because of how little play it saw. and also because it was funny because of how much people hyped up this card. A lot of people were like, this card's insane, it's going to be the best thing ever, and then nobody played it. But that doesn't mean the card was absolutely terrible and just is a bad card you should immediately get rid of. Well, if you have it now, you should probably get rid of it, but in general, I do think that this card is honestly better than Minority Recruits. And in fact, I'd even put it better than, well, I wouldn't put it better than Heroes of the Soviet Union, but I would put it better than 6th Airborne. Then we have the Naval Brigade. I think this is the 6th today. Are they both 6th? I'm curious about that. I've never really thought about it. No, it is the 60th? What's the Naval Brigade? Okay, not even close. I was thinking it costs 6. It is the 83rd Naval Brigade. Naval Brigade is just one of those always good, kind of similar to the KV. Back in the day, I would probably have put this up into S tier, just because removal was harder to come by, and ambush was harder to get around, so an ambush guard is incredibly powerful. So a 6-cost remove a unit, and also it's an ambush guard, is an insane card. However, that its insanity as a card has dropped drastically. It's a lot easier to get around ambush guard, and also the game has moved away from just whoever can stick the biggest unit for a turn. Also, as I mentioned previously with why Minority Recruits was bad, was you would have all of these cannot be targeted by orders tanks that were the best cards in the game. Well, Naval Brigade is not an order, so this was one of the only ways to just immediately destroy any of these units. So Naval Brigade was like a very, very crucial, critical card for Soviets' control's existence in the meta for a very long time. These days, it's no longer like the bomb it used to be. However, it's still very good. You still play it in Soviet control today, and it's difficult to imagine a world where you would never play this card. It is definitely possible to imagine a world where you would consider cutting this card. So I will leave it down here with KV. KV is easier to run in a wider variety of decks. However, I do think I would put Naval Brigade slightly higher, just because I do think that its impact on in the decks that it's played in and in the games that it's played is slightly higher, just because it is slightly more reactive, so it's easier to sort of hold onto in a losing situation, whereas KV is sometimes just terrible in a losing situation because your opponent's at like 20 health and you're going to die on board and it doesn't have guard and it doesn't destroy anything. Whereas Naval Brigade can be really good when you're ahead, and it can also be really good when you're behind. Then we have Night Witches, and I'm not going to make this video 2 hours long by getting into a whole history of Night Witches. But let's just say the current version of Night Witches is that it adds 3 Polycarpovs to your hand, and these Polycarpovs are 1/2 bombers with destructions that they add from the peoples to your hand. So basically, it's like instead of drawing cards, it adds, it's almost like card draw, but it doesn't get you closer to fatigue. Because in a single order, it gives you a bunch of things to play, either on a following turn or with your remaining credits. Now, a lot of people look at this card and they're like, well, it's like kind of like 6 cost, because it's 3 cost to add 3 1-cost things to your hand, and then you have to play those, and then those things give you more things that then you have to play cost more, so it's a really expensive card. And it's true that it's really expensive, but I also feel like people kind of think about this card the wrong way, because you sort of play this in a similar situation where you would play Convoy in like a Britain control deck, where sometimes you just play Convoy to get some more cards in your hand, and this is essentially 3 cost, draw 3 cards. Now, it's 3 cards that your opponent knows what they are, and you know what they are, and it's not other cards in your deck, so it's not getting you closer to like your Depths of Winter or whatever card you're looking for in that situation. But if you're like, you know, it's relatively early in the game, it's going to be a slow game, particularly against control, or maybe you're a little bit ahead against a more tempo-oriented deck, just slam a Night Witches, and you don't have to drop them all immediately. You can play it and drop none of them. You don't even have to, like, you can just play it on turn 3, and then maybe you play a 4-drop on turn 4, and then a 5-drop on turn 5, and then on turn 6 you play a second 5-drop, and then one of those Night Witches. Or one of the Polycarpovs. It's a very flexible card. Now, the issue with this card actually turns out to be hand space, because although Soviets don't have a huge source of draw, they just play their cards so slowly that they often have relatively big hands. And also, the games where Night Witches is best are the games where you are going to have these huge hands. And Night Witches just becomes a liability, because if you at any point you play it, you immediately add 2 additional cards to your hand, on top of the Night Witches itself. As in, like, you replace the Night Witches and then add 2 additional cards on top of that, and then those are cards which will kind of stay in your hand forever. And what I mean by that is you can't dump them for hand space if you are reaching your hand limit. Because let's say you draw at the start of your turn, you go up to 9 cards in hand, and you're like, I'm going to overdraw a card. Let me play down my 3 Night Witches. I go down to 6 cards in my hand, and now your opponent plays, you know, like a Bomber Mafia, kills all your Night Witches, and now you get 3 from the Peoples to your hand, and now you go straight back up to 9 cards in your hand. So, because it's primarily your opponent who controls when these Night Witches dies, you are basically just taking away hand size limit for the foreseeable future if you ever play Night Witches. And sometimes that does not matter at all. Sometimes you just run out of cards. Sometimes your opponent you're just playing cards as quickly as possible. Sometimes you don't care about overdraw and it's not a value matchup. However, sometimes it is. And because of that, Night Witches is definitely not an auto-include. And I would put it down here in B tier. I definitely see the argument for putting it down into C tier. I think a lot of people would put this into C tier just because it almost never sees play. But I think I don't think people are wrong for not playing it in their decks. I think people are wrong for not experimenting with it more compared to other cards that do see a lot of experimentation. Because I think Night Witches is a lot better than people give it credit for. Now, obviously, it can also be used aggressively in Soviet Air, because Soviet Air is a very aggressive archetype. And when used aggressively, Night Witches can be terrified because Soviet Air revolves around Blood Red Sky, and Blood Red Sky is buff all of your Soviet Air units, so you want a lot of them, and Night Witches is just a very effective card for that, because Soviet Air does not typically have very good card draw, and you're just basically trying to run them out of air units, and then if one card in their hand turns into 3 air units, which then give them additional cards in their hand after that, it's a very powerful card, but obviously Soviet Air is not that good. So yeah, I would leave Night Witches down here in B tier. Then we have Parade, and this is a card which has been gone for a very long time. Honestly, this is like a very old card in my mind. This brings me back to the days. Parade says, draw a unit from your deck and add a duplicate of it to your hand. So basically, it is a convoy. It is a 3 credits, draw 2 cards. Now, another way you can think of this is as an Arctic convoy, which is 4 credits, draw 2 units, because this will exclusively draw units, and it will draw 2 of them. Now, it can be better or it can be worse than an Arctic convoy. Where it can be better is quite obvious. You can hit a very, very good unit in your deck. You can hit an elite unit in your deck, and now you have 2 copies of that elite. And also, it only draws 1 card from your deck, instead of 2 cards from your deck, which is much better once you go down into Fatigue. It's essentially generating an extra random unit into your deck, and while acting as card draw, which got you slightly thinner into your deck to be more consistently hitting your other cards. Where it can be a lot worse than an Arctic Convoy is it only actually draws 1 unit, so if you're in a situation where you're like, I need a guard unit to survive, and you play an Arctic Convoy, well, you have 2 shots at hitting a guard unit. If you play Parade, you have 1 shot at hitting a guard unit, because it's the same unit. You draw 1 unit and then get a copy of it. So, Parade is a very polarizing card. They were, back in the days of old-school Soviet control, being a very popular tournament deck. There was a lot of games decided by what each player's Parade hit. There was a lot of Soviet mirrors, and many a Soviet mirror came down to one player hit Parade into 272nd, and then they had 2 272nds, and the other player hit Parade into like an 845th, and then they had 2 845ths. And if your opponent has an extra 272nd and you have an extra 845th, you're probably losing that game. Now, how good is this card? Just card draw is always going to be good, and this is essentially a card draw. I'm just going to put it up into A tier, I feel like. It's not a flashy card, it's not an amazing card, and there's definitely a lot of decks that wouldn't run this card in general. However, it's basically just Convoy, and Convoy is an S tier card, and this is a sometimes better, sometimes worse Convoy. So I'm just going to leave it down here in A tier. Because I do think the variety of this card is a lot higher, or like the variations in what this card can do is a lot higher, and I do think it tends to be slightly worse than Convoy. Because also, Convoy, because we compared to Arctic Convoy, no one plays Arctic Convoy. Comparing it to Convoy, Convoy crucially can draw orders, and orders tend to be typically the cards that turn games around, much more so than units. So yeah. Also, card draw tends to be in the form of orders, so Convoy is more likely to draw you into additional card draw, whereas Parade is not. So, with all that being said, I do think Parade is slightly worse than Convoy in general, and Convoy's S tier, so Parade is going to go down here into A tier. Then we have a Red Banner, which is a very odd card in that it was nerfed, and if you read the card, I think it might be surprising to a lot of players to hear that it was nerfed. It is a 2-cost, destroy a friendly unit at a random unit from the same nation of cost 2 greater than the unit destroyed. That's probably not how they worded it, but you get the point. And this card used to be 1, and it was so powerful that they had to nerf it, and that was because it would combine with cards that would generate friendly units that would die at the end of your turn, cards like Siberian Transfer. It would generate with very specific, or it would work with very specific cards, like, as aforementioned, 272nd, to turn into 2 Stalins. But most critically, it would work with cards that would steal the enemy's units temporarily, like Confucian and Partisans, and then that could give you a massive tempo swing very early on in the game. If you're able to steal their unit, use it to make a value trade, and then destroy that unit and turn it into something else before it goes back to them with Partisans. So yeah, it's just a absolutely insanely powerful card that doesn't really look it. And obviously, it's kind of been overshadowed since then by Stand Together, just because Stand Together it gives them Blitz, and Red Banner does not give them Blitz. But that being said, Red Banner is still a very, very solid card. I would put it up in A tier, just because there is so much you can do with it, and maybe we put it down here at high B tier, just because it does cost 2, and also I do feel like Stand Together, there's a lot of times where Stand Together will give Red Banner a run for its money. That being said, Red Banner is just a very powerful card. Obviously, it is rotated at the moment. I have no idea if they ever plan to bring it back or not. I think it would probably be safe to bring it back, but you never know. Then we have Road to Berlin, which is honestly one of my favorite cards in the game. I love the HQ damage cards. I tried so hard to make all of them work. And Road to Berlin is easily the most played out of the 5 of these, and still saw fairly little play. And that's just because it's difficult to damage the opponent's HQ. It's obviously, your first thought is you want to run this in an aggressive deck, but if you're playing in an aggressive deck that's going to have lots of ways to deal 3 damage to the opponent immediately, wouldn't you just rather have an additional card that does 3 damage rather than a card that gives you stuff if you do 3 damage? And then they're kind of difficult to run in a lot of control decks, like ATS, for example, is probably more control-oriented. Just because if you're control deck, when are you hitting the opponent in the HQ? You're typically trying to control the board more so than rush your opponent down. And Road to Berlin was just a perfect card because 1, it costed 1 credit, which was very cheap. 2, Soviets did have some cards that would damage the enemy HQ incidentally, like Winter Offensive, which we'll be getting to shortly. Or KV, if the opponent's drawing multiple cards in a turn. And 3, it was a card that let you race down burn decks, which was sometimes an issue that Soviets would have, particularly against Jaguar, sometimes against Air, if you're able to wrest control of the board from them, but you're relatively low health. They would just straight burn you down, and if you're playing something like an Engineers, you can't force your opponent to kill your own units. It's difficult to kill your own units by yourself. However, if you have Road to Berlin, that's just, I'm getting 3 health a turn every time I attack you in the face, so if you're just going to try to rush me down, I'm just going to heal 3 every turn, because I'm going to be hitting you in the face. And that was just pretty good. Obviously, infinitely worse than Engineers Battalion. This is not getting anywhere near the S tier. But I do think that this was just a very solid card that went under the radar for a very long time. Obviously, some people did play it a little bit. And yeah, I think it's just a very solid B tier card. I don't think there's any ever world where it goes up to A tier, just because you would rather better, more consistent ways to gain health. And you have better, more consistent ways to gain health. So it's going into B tier. Where exactly in B tier? I think probably between ISU and 272nd, perhaps. Now we have Siberian Transfer, and Siberian Transfer is another weird card that saw a lot of play back in the day because Red Banner cost 1. But outside of like trying to do something cheeky on turn 3 with Siberian Transfer, Red Banner on turn 3 to just get a 7-drop, which sometimes would win you the game, and sometimes would get retreated immediately and you spend 2 cards doing basically nothing. But Siberian Transfer, it's just a much better 6th Airborne, because instead of spending 6 credits for a 6/8 infantry, you're spending 2 credits to just get the tank immediately, and that's much easier to use. 4 credits to deal 5 damage to the front line, 6 credits to deal 5 damage to the support line, which is not an amazing rate, but it's not the worst thing in the world. It's much better than 6th Airborne. So yeah, Siberian Transfer, it was alright. Obviously, Baron made the Siberian Transfer OTK deck. That has nothing to do with Siberian Transfer being a particularly good card. It just happened to be one of the better ways to exploit Great Patriotic War being an insane card. By getting just a Blitz tank to buff with Ura. So Siberian Transfer is just going to be going down into the C tier for me. However, it's probably the best out of the C tier cards, just because it is so much better than 6th Airborne. However, I do think it is substantially worse than Night Witches. Maybe with the T-34 cards, it gets better, but even with the T-34 cards, it's difficult to imagine a world where Siberian Transfer is incredible. Maybe I'm underrating it and it should be in B tier, but it definitely is not getting any higher than B tier. Then we have the T-28, a card which once cost me a tournament position. That's a long story that I'm not sure I've ever told on YouTube. Maybe I should make a video about that someday. But the T-28 is a very fun Soviet card that was introduced, I think, shortly after they got rid of the permanent fatigue Night Witches First Rifles cards from Soviets, and they wanted to bring it back in a slightly much worse way. So the T-28 is a pincer on a 2/3 smokescreen blitz tank, and the pincer is shuffle this, or put when there's like destruction, put this on the top of your deck. And pincer is target a friendly unit and give it this effect, as well as like both units gain the effect until one of them dies, and then they both lose the effect. So basically, what you could do is if you had a unit on the board, you could play T-28, attack something for 2 damage, and then it dies, and then it goes down to the top of your deck, and you could use that to infinitely avoid fatigue. Or you could play this on something really big and scary, like a 272nd, and then you trade the 272nd in, and it dies, and you get the destruction effect, so you get the Stalin, and then you get a second 272nd on top of your deck. So it is just a way to generate value, or it's a way to avoid fatigue. Now, unfortunately, neither generating value or avoiding fatigue ended up being that critical in the game plan of any real Soviet control deck, but there were situations where that would matter, and sometimes, if you were a particularly talented player who understood the deck very well, you would pick T-28 off of Heroes of the Soviet Union, because it would be the best option in that situation, particularly if you're either you just have 3 really bad options, or you're later in the game and you're offered some medium options and a T-28, and you recognize that the T-28 might be more impactful. However, you do need a unit on the board to trigger its pincer, which can be difficult if your opponent clears, like, the Engineers Battalion. It can be difficult to stick a unit on the board to be able to go infinite. But even if you just avoid, like, 2 or 3 fatigues, and then they remove all of your units, or you're forced to just duplicate something else, or whatever it is, 2 or 3 extra avoiding fatigues and 2 or 3 additional, like, 2-3 tanks to throw at the opponent can sometimes be the difference between winning and losing a tight fatigue, a tight control game that's headed to fatigue. So with all that being said, this is very clearly a C tier card. It has its niche situations, but that niche situation is never going to show up enough for you to want to put this into your deck. And with Heroes of the Soviet Union only becoming worse, it is going to have fewer ways of getting this card into your deck, even if you're not running it. So it is going to be going down here into C tier. I do think it is still probably a better than the 6th Airborne. The 6th Airborne really taking a beating here. Might just be the worst Soviet unit by a wide margin. But then we get to the other option for the worst Soviet Union unit, and this is the Tomahawk, and I'm just going to double check what it does. So yeah, the Tomahawk is a 3-cost 2/3 fighter with units or infantry units you play or add get +1/+1. I think it used to not say or add. I think it used to be just units you deploy, and it was terrible. I could be misremembering that though, so don't quote me on that. But anyways, the idea of this card is very clearly it's a tokens card. It's intended to be a tokens card. It's intended that you play this card and then you play tokens, and all of the tokens come down with an additional +1/+1 if the Tomahawk is on the board. Unfortunately, it is a 3-cost card, so at early you're getting it down on turn 3, and that's your entire turn, and tokens is a deck that wants to snowball earlier than that. Like, your turn 3 wants to be playing a bunch of tokens on the board, so your turn 4 can be buffing those tokens. You don't want to be playing turn 3 playing a unit that has to not be removed, that then might buff your tokens on turn 4, because then you're just falling an entire turn behind. And yeah, it's actually just never really worked out. In a tokens deck, you're never really getting like 7-8 credits in a game where you're realistically winning, or at least you're not getting that consistently enough to want to run Tomahawk to do something like a Tomahawk no surrender. And yeah, just playing it on turn 3 is typically the worst thing you could be doing on turn 3 in a tokens deck, other than passing. And if playing it is only better than passing, that's a very low bar. Tomahawk is honestly just a bad card. It is straight up, it is not really supported. Maybe you can make some like ultra aggressive 1-cost 0-op or 0-cost 0-op infantry oriented, very aggressive deck that you run Tomahawk in, but even then, it's not like you're keeping Tomahawk in the mulligan. And also, that deck sounds bad. So yeah, Tomahawk is going down here in D tier. Easily the worst Soviet elite that we've looked at so far. Then we have Tractor Factories. And Tractor Factories, oh boy, compared to frontal, not frontal assault, front formation. I have tokens on the mind. Tractor Factories is an 8-cost order that says add 2 T-34 1942s to your support line. And of course, this is the 5/5 Blitz tank. These ones do not die at the end of your turn, unlike with Siberian Transfer and the 6th Airborne. Tractor Factories is, sometimes you just want to play it on turn 8 to get 2 5/5 tanks, and that's just kind of value. It's honestly similar to the recently reduced to 5-cost M4A2, the 4/4 tank that summons the other 4/4 tank, and also their Shermans. Compare that to Tractor Factories, where people were actually playing Tractor Factories on turn 8 to just turn 8 summon 2 5/5 tanks. Back in the day, how the power creep has flown. But of course, you could also wait until turn 12 and you play Tractor Factories, and then you can move and attack with one of the tanks, or you can attack with both of the tanks to things in the front line, or you can move both of the tanks. And, you know, that's fine. It kind of falls into the same category of 6th Airborne, where it's like, yeah, it's value, and it's value that if you have a ton of credits, can also impact the board the turn you play it. Now, it is better than 6th Airborne, but by a very, very small amount. It's really only because the 6th Airborne tank dies. If the 6th Airborne tank didn't die, it would be a lot better, by a wide margin. Unfortunately, it does die, so Tractor Factories is mildly better than that, but this is down in C tier. I think back in the day, I put Tractor Factories into B tier. It saw a ton of play in Soviet control for a very long time, but that was really just because 272nd didn't exist yet. And as soon as 272nd it sort of was released, people pretty immediately realized this is a much better source of value than Tractor Factories, and they cut Tractor Factories. And then some very, very greedy players would run both as just a way to outgreed other control decks, because, you know, if you play an additional 8-cost value-generating card over your opponent, and that's the only difference between your decks, you're probably going to win a Soviet control game. But Tractor Factories, it really just has gotten power-crept, because honestly, I feel like the first cards to get power-crept in any given game is, like, the big things. And when you're just a very, very slow summon a couple vanilla tanks, that's going to get power crept real fast, and that's going to be dropping down here into C tier. It, honestly, compared to the Stalin, I feel like just the Stalin is difficult to remove for certain decks, and I think that is going to always be true. There's always going to be some decks that rely more on retreat than direct removal. So just like stabbing down a Stalin, it's probably going to be better than tractor factories. The other thing is tractor factories, they can attack immediately, so like, I don't know, it's hard to compare. I do feel like there's certain decks where you just rather play down a Stalin and say checkmate into certain decks. Tractor factories, it's very difficult to imagine a world where this card is really ever going to make a comeback. So we're going to put it down here in the middle of C tier. And then we have the Armored Train. And the Armored Train is an absolutely cracked card. Is this S tier? Is this A tier? I'm going to have to think about that for a second here, but the Armored Train, for those who don't know, is a 5-cost, 5-operation cost, 3/7 tank with guard, with heavy armor 1, and at the end of every turn it summons a light infantry. Now, in light infantry, you might think this is a tokens card. It is not really a tokens card because it costs 5 and it summons them 1 at a time at the end of your turn, which is kind of just everything you don't want to hear if you're a tokens deck. But what this card is an incredibly powerful Soviet control card. And that's just because a 5-cost, 3/7 heavy armor 1 guard unit is a pretty good body, especially on a tank. And also, the can't attack doesn't really matter, but it also just summons additional 1/1 units. And, you know, against some decks that doesn't really matter. Like, you're just going to, like, hit, like, you're going to ping a unit. Maybe they get rid of Armored Train immediately. You got a 1/1, doesn't really matter. But against some decks, it can actually be really, really good, particularly against Jaguar, where all of their units have 1 health. And usually when Armored Train comes down, if they don't have an immediate way to answer it, their strategy is to flood the front line and then try to get down like a Blitzkrieg or some Type 93s to buff up the attack of the flooded front line, and then trade like 3 units into the Armored Train. And that's a lot harder to do when they also have a 1/1, which is going to then be able to trade into the biggest unit you have in the front line at the end of your turn after you flood. So Armored Train, very, very powerful card. Obviously, there's the suppress. If it does get suppressed, it can now attack at 5 operation, which is probably not something you're going to do. However, it is, again, just another one of those cards where it's like, every Soviet elite you kind of want to be able to suppress. So I don't think I can reasonably put it up into S tier, just because it's so much worse than the cards that are already in S tier. I will put it up into higher in A tier than even Naval Brigade. And maybe this isn't going to age well. Like, Naval Brigade does have an immediate impact. However, just Armored Train, with all the power creeping that's happened in the last, like, you know, like 5-6 expansions and cards, Armored Train is still a very powerful card that is one of the best things to play on curve across all nations in Standard. And that is a testament to just how powerful its body is. We would have to get bonkers with just the effects of cards and the size of cards for Armored Train to really fall off the map hard, I think. So yeah, we're going to leave Armored Train up in 8 here, but not pushing it harder. Then we have Upgrade, and Upgrade I probably went into D tier last time I made this tier list, to be completely honest, as in, like, back in the day. Like 2 years ago or whenever that was. And that was just because Upgrade is very conditional on the cards that exist in the game. So Upgrade says, destroy a friendly tank and add a tank of the same nation that costs 3 more to your support line. So the issue with this card is you need a tank that costs 3 more. And if there is not a tank that costs 3 more, you cannot play Upgrade on the unit. Now, you can absolutely upgrade some 7-cost units, like the KV2, into a Yosef Stalin. You can upgrade a 2-cost unit, like a BT or a T70, into the 5-cost T34s. That's pretty good. However, what is the #1 most, like, played Soviet tank? In terms of, like, just generating it and wanting to target it with Upgrade? Well, it is the 5-cost T34 that you're getting off of Tractor Factories, you're getting off of 6th Airborne, you're getting off of Siberian Transfer. Nowadays, you're getting it off of Front Formation. And the issue, when Upgrade came out, was there was no 8-cost tanks. So you literally could not play Upgrade on Siberian Transfer, or the T34 off of Siberian Transfer. You just straight up couldn't. Obviously, there's no 13-cost cards, and you couldn't play this on, like, a Stalin. You couldn't play this on, well, you could technically play it on a KV and get the ISU, but the ISU is not, it doesn't trigger the effect when you get it, so you wouldn't really want it, and you can't play it on the KV, or so you can't play it on the ISU. So it was just a really, really awkward card that just had no place in any deck, and it was basically just terrible. However, since they've introduced an 8-cost tank, and also the tank theming in general has gotten a lot better for Soviets, I honestly think Upgrade is a very solid card. It's very similar to Red Banners, but just slightly more specific on what decks that you're able to play it in, because it can only be played on tanks, whereas Red Banner can be played on anything. But honestly, Upgrade, very, very solid card. And I'm just going to leave it down here with Red Banner. I'm going to put it slightly lower than Red Banner, just because Red Banner, I think, is going to age better, because Upgrade requires there to be tanks that you want, whereas Red Banner can be played on anything. There's an upside with Upgrade, in that it can only give you tanks, so it's much easier to get a consistent unit out of that, because we are more likely for a long time going to only have one 8-cost tank or one 10-cost tank, or, you know, the higher numbers of tanks, which are the ones you're most likely going to be trying to get with Upgrade, you're going to be more consistently hitting the same units, whereas Red Banner, you're going to be starting to hit a wider variety of units at a much faster rate over time. However, upgrades can also be very good as an aggressive tool, just to get a 5-cost tank, and doesn't really matter which one it is. It's just going to be a random 5-cost tank. However, if you were to try to do the Red Banner with a similar thing in an aggressive deck where you're just trying to get a random 4-cost unit or a random 5-cost unit across all unit types, there's some stinkers out there. So, honestly, I think I've talked myself into saying upgrade is slightly better. Maybe if they ever go back to unit stealing again of your opponent, but I don't think that's design space that they really want to go back to, given just how much hatred they have seemed to have shown to that archetype. So with that being said, maybe Upgrade is just going to age slightly better than Red Banner, but they're very neck and neck, the two of them. Then we have Winter Offensive. This used to be the big Soviet board clear before ISU, and then ISU got changed to its current version, and then you would play ISU and Winter Offensive. And man, the things we would do with Winter Offensive is an 8-cost order, deal 8 damage to all targets. So it does, or not 8 damage, oh my god, that would be insane. Sorry, deal 4 damage to all targets for 8 cost. So it's dealing damage to both enemies HQ, and it's dealing damage to all units on the board. And obviously, this is really, really bad. Like, compare this to Carpet Bombing. This is substantially worse than Carpet Bombing the vast majority of the time. However, Carpet Bombing is not a Soviet card, and when Winter Offensive came out, people thought it was going to stink, because they were like, why would you ever want to play this card? They drastically underestimated how much Soviets wanted any form of board clear whatsoever, and Winter Offensive saw a ton of play. However, basically since Depths of Winter got released, Winter Offensive has seen substantially less play, and I'm now realizing that I must have refreshed the tab, because the newer clump of elites since last time I did this list are not here yet, so we do have a few more to go for, including the aforementioned Depths of Winter. But Winter Offensive, really, it saw its time in the sun, but it is a card that's just so terrible that it's only going to get worse, and like, there's an argument that for a time you were more confident running Winter Offensive than ISU, just because ISU required like a 2-card combo, and certain decks just didn't really have the board clears. And like, you were running Road to Berlin, and Winter Offensive could trigger Road to Berlin. Like, there was a point where people were playing Winter Offensive over ISU. Instead of playing both, they would only run Winter Offensive and not ISU. That being said, I think ISU is probably just a much better card overall. Just because Winter Offensive is so dangerous. The reliable ways of dealing burn damage and lowering your opponent quickly are being printed much faster than reliable ways to out-heal that. So dealing 4 damage to yourself in a board clear is very, very expensive for a board clear that's only coming out on turn 8. Yeah, Winter Offensive has aged very, very poorly, unfortunately. And I'm now going to have to put down into C tier. But we're going to put it very high in C tier. Just because it's a board clear. Board clears are just always going to be fine. Honestly, maybe I'm focusing a bit too much on where I think it's going to go. We'll put it down into low B tier. Also, it evens out these 2 lanes. Then we have the Yak 7. So the Yak 7 is a 2-cost 2/2 fighter with, at the start of your turn, deal 1 damage to your HQ and draw an extra card. So this has been run in a variety of different decks, and this is like sort of the little card that could. At first, people saw this and they were like, "This seems pretty good. It says draw a card." And then people tried to play it, and they realized, well, sometimes you don't want to take damage. Sometimes, like, your opponent will just leave it up and force you to take damage. Sometimes they'll leave it up and force you to get card draw. And if they want to remove it, it's relatively easy to remove. And then people kind of stopped playing it and didn't see play in Soviet control for a long time. And then self-damage came around, and people realized that, like, oh, this is just straight upside. If you can play a Yak 7 on, like, turn 2, and it sticks, you're probably going to win the game. And, like, if you can get it out on turn 1, or you get it out on turn 2 going first, it drastically reduces their ability to remove it, and suddenly you're just going absolutely insane because your deck is so loaded with early game removal, and this card was absolutely nuts in self-damage to the point where you would almost want to concede the second you saw Yak 7 come out on turn 2 if you didn't have a way to remove it immediately. And then, with increased play from self-damage, it sort of saw make its way back into Soviet control because people were just playing it more. They realized that, honestly, maybe we misevaluated this card at the beginning. Also, it's just a fighter, which is very good against Soviet control's main enemy, Brit Air. You know, it was good even in tokens, just because any form of card draw is good, and if your opponent can't remove it, you get card draw, and that's almost exclusively upside. And if your opponent can remove it, you just play something else. I don't know, you played a 2-cost unit and your opponent responded to it. That's just playing a game of cards. Keep going on, play your other cards. Doesn't really matter. It's not a huge tempo loss to play a 2-drop that your opponent has to respond to. So yeah, Yak 7 ended up being just a very, very good card, and we are going to put it up into A tier. It's quite comparable to Parade. I'm going to put Yak 7 slightly above Parade just because Yak 7 is a much better card in a wider variety of decks, because if you're playing anything even remotely aggressive, you want Yak 7 in your deck, just because on the off chance that it is going to draw you a ton of cards. Also, it's going to attack the enemy HQ from the support line, which is always nice, and it's only 1 op, so just getting a little bit of extra chip damage in there is really good. Also, don't really care about the HQ damage if you're playing an aggressive deck, and sometimes that's even an upside if you're playing like a mid-range self-damage deck. Whereas Parade, there's certain decks where Parade is just a little bit too slow. Then we have another piece of Soviet card draw. It is Zhukov, and this card has gone through a lot of different versions. This is the card that used to let you cheat out cards, because it used to say draw a Soviet infantry. Or it used to say draw an infantry from your deck, reduce its cost by 3, and then it was reduce its cost by 3 until the end of your turn, and then it was reduce its cost by 2 until the end of your turn. And now it is draw a random Soviet infantry from your deck, and it gets +1/+1 in Blitz. And this is just a very solid card. 1 credit, draw a card from your deck, and make it more impactful than it used to be. It's just a very solid card. It's Monty-esque in that it is a card that there is never a reason not to put the card in your deck. Obviously, it's worse than Monty. I'm not saying that this is as good as Monty. To be very clear, pinning a unit, or pinning 3 units is much better than getting +1/+1 in Blitz on a card in your hand. However, that being said, there's very few decks that don't want Zhukov. Basically, you need to not run any Soviet infantry. Or you need to be playing a deck that is so jam-packed full of removal and very specific answers, and it's a deck that's intending to, like, win on fatigue, that you don't want to draw a card, and you don't want a card with very little, like, sort of card slot impact, like Zhukov in your deck, to make that work. But, like, outside of that, if you just played any other Soviet control or Soviet deck, period, you absolutely want Zhukov. It's great in self-damage, it's great in control. It's just an absolutely insane card. And it is absolutely going up here in A tier. Where exactly in A tier it goes is a little hard to say. I think maybe here between KV and the Yak, just because Zhukov is an incredible card, and unless Cards ever reaches the point where people stop playing infantry, and if we ever reach that point, there's been a massive failure on the behalf of 1939 from a design perspective. I think Zhukov is always just going to have a place in most Soviet decks. And now, let me just quickly add the remaining cards. Alrighty, so these cards are in no particular order. Actually, the order might in fact be reverse order. I'm not positive here. But we are going to start with the Covert Operations card, Strategic Focus. So strategic focus, 7 cost order, choose 1, deal 5 damage to all ground units, or deal 5 damage to all air units. And you get to pick, but obviously it affects both sides of the board. This is an incredibly powerful card because, one, sometimes you just don't have units on the board, so you don't really care. But also, sometimes you can play this in a deck like Soviet Air and pick ground units, and you run almost no ground units. Or you can play this against a deck like Britain Air, which, again, the #1 nemesis of Soviet control, and you say deal damage to air units, and it takes out all the air units without getting rid of any of your guards or like tanks or whatever that are going to now stick around on your opponent's empty board. And obviously, there's all sorts of situations in between. It's also particularly good against ramp, because ramp will have a lot of 5 health bombers, like the B-24s, which are 5 health heavy armor bombers, but there's also like the Lancaster at 4 health, Wellington at 4 health, or not Wellington at 3 health, the Halifax at 4 health is the card I was thinking of. And, you know, sometimes Soviet control can struggle against ramp just because it can be difficult to get rid of these big bombers if they come down fast enough or if they're protected by enough guards. So strategic focus, oftentimes against ramp, you're just literally using it to trade 1-for-1 with the bomber, and you're perfectly fine with that. Strategic focus is just a really good card. It's just a very solid card. Now, as 7, it's not going into S tier. You know, this is one of the better AoEs in the game. But it's not anything too cracked. It's going to go solidly here into A tier, where exactly between these, it's kind of hard to say. All of these A tier ones are just really, really good. But yeah, let's just leave it here. Then we have the Bazista. Let me check the name of this card. The Bazitsa. I'm probably butchering that. I don't speak Russian. But yeah, this is also came out in Covert Operations. Obviously, it has Covert. It's a 3-cost, 3/6 infantry with Covert and Guard. And the text at the start of your turn, like, remove 2 credits and give all friendly units +2 attack. Now, this is a card which has been very, very difficult to evaluate. It was difficult to evaluate in testing. It was difficult to evaluate once it came out. And honestly, I've played around with this card a bunch, I've played against this card a bunch. It's still very difficult to evaluate, because if you ignore the covert part of the card, it's a 3-cost, 3/6 infantry guard, which is just really good. That is just well above average, well above the curve stats for cost. It's just a very solid body. And it also has covert, which in some cases makes it much better because it's harder to remove with orders. In some cases, it makes it a lot worse because a guard with covert only matters if they attack into it, and if they just go face, it doesn't really have guard until you uncover it. The other issue is its effect, because sometimes you have 2 credits to spend, and you'll have a bunch of units on board, and spending 2 credits to buff the attack of all of your units is incredibly powerful, especially if you're playing a deck like Air, like Soviet Air, or Artillery, or just like a more mid-range board floody type of Soviet deck, often like Soviet France with like Rimas and stuff. Will have this playstyle. Any of those decks, and this effect will oftentimes be really, really effective, of just giving +2 attack, and that if it sticks on the board, it will give +2 attack multiple times, and that's going to be incredibly powerful and can theoretically end out the game very quickly. The issue is, it is not a choose to spend 2 credits to give your units +2 attack. So the issue is, sometimes you'll play this on turn 3, and then your opponent will like go all face except for 1 unit, and then attack into this at the end of their turn, which uncovers it. But the guard doesn't matter because they already attacked face and made all of the other trades that they wanted. And then it reveals this, and then you lose 2 of your 4 credits on turn 4. And now you can't play a 4-drop. And also, this guy has so much health you can't trade him away, which means your opponent maybe just chooses to develop the board, doesn't trade out the Bazitsa, and now you're going to be losing an additional 2 credits on turn 5, and now you've just completely lost the game because this guy cost you 4 additional credits in the first 5 turns of the game to do basically nothing. So it's a very difficult card to evaluate. And because of that, I'm going to put it down into B tier. I have yet to see any decks make me think that this card was, like, incredible. And, like, oh, I need to run this card in this deck. However, I have definitely seen some times where I'm like, oh, that's a really good card. Maybe I should try that out in these types of decks. And because it's so difficult to evaluate, it's kind of hard to really see how this this card will age. In terms of just like, you know, are we going to be wanting to run this card in decks in the future? It's still very difficult to say. My money is on no, though. I feel like as time goes on, we'll have better cards to spend our credits on, so cards that make you spend additional credits for a little upside will just kind of get worse, because you would just rather be doing the more unfair things as the power corrupt cards are released. So we're going to put it down here into B tier. But absolutely, I would love to be proven wrong and for somebody to show me just how cracked Bazit can be. Speaking of cracked, we have the 96th, the 97th rifles, something like that. This also came out in Covert Operations. It is a 1-cost, 1/2 infantry with guard and destruction. Shuffle a 554th infantry into your deck, something like that. Draw a card, and the infantry it shuffles into the deck is a 2-cost, 5/5 infantry with destruction. Deal 3 damage to yourself and draw 3 cards. Something like that. I'm completely misremembering all of the numbers on this card for some reason, because it happens fairly often. But when this card came out, or when this card was first revealed, I wasn't too sold on this card. I thought this was a worse Bloody Sickle. And, you know, sometimes you absolutely would want to play 5 Bloody Sickles, and sometimes you wouldn't want to play 5 Bloody Sickles. So I saw this as probably a high... When evaluating this card before it came out, I would probably have put it high B tier. Since it's coming out, honestly, I'd probably still put it at high B tier. It's seen a lot more play than I expected it to. But with that being said, it still has the same issue that I had with it. Like, my issue with it wasn't proven to be wrong. It's more just the meta that we've had since this card has come out has been completely acceptable for this card. And maybe that's just the meta that we're going to have for the rest of the game, where you don't really care about the fact that it draws you cards. And it's just purely upside, or you try to end the game before fatigue really matters, either way. But I absolutely could imagine a world where, like, you know, that this is just kind of an average card. I think I'll leave it here up in A tier. Maybe slightly above Parade, just because it's 1 credit. It's something you could always just throw into your deck to make it better against aggro. And yeah, this is a similarly somewhat difficult card to evaluate. But I've been pleasantly surprised with both seeing it see play and playing it with myself. Still not that insane of a card, but it's there. Then we have the Beriev, and oh boy, Beriev is a difficult card to evaluate, because it is a 3-cost, 1/4 fighter with units you deploy cost 2 less. When you deploy a unit, retreat this. So you can play it on turn 3, and then on turn 4, you can play a 6-cost unit that's discounted by 2, and at the cost of returning Beriev to your hand. So it's kind of like a war production that is worse in every conceivable measure. Trust me, I have tried to fit Beriev into, like, mid-range decks, into control decks. It's just like, you know, maybe I play it on turn 3, and maybe they traded out, and if they traded it out, it was basically like a 1/4 guard, which is bad, but not terrible. And if they don't trade it out, maybe I could cheat out something big and scary, or not even cheat something out. Maybe I just get to play a 2-drop and a 4-drop on turn 4. And maybe that's just really good. Or maybe I'm able to attack with Beriev, you know, hit like a 2/1 with Beriev, it goes down to a 1/2, and then I retreat it back to my hand, well played, something discounted, and then I can replay Beriev. The issue is those situations basically never work out. This card just sucks if you try to play it on face value. Now, obviously, it has created the naturally named Beriev OTK, where you basically just get 2 Berievs on the board, so that all cards cost 4 less, and then you make sure, and then you play a 3rd Beriev from your hand, and then you make, am I doing this right? You make one of the Berievs on board not able to retreat, and then you make 1 Beriev not able to retreat, and then you get 2 more Berievs in your hand, and then you play the first Beriev, and when they can't retreat, and now the next Beriev costs 0, and it retreats one of the 2 Berievs on the board, and then you can play that Beriev, and it costs 0, and it retreats the other one. And then the other unit you get down on the board is the Kitty Hawk that deals 1 damage to the enemy every time you play a unit, and then you play Beriev, the Berievs over and over and over. If you've ever seen the deck, it's very funny. but obviously it is not a serious competitive deck. However, there's what are the odds that you can use Beriev in a weird way in the future? Like, you know, maybe they push the can't be suppressed, can't be retreated mechanic, and it becomes easier to use Beriev as just like a massive credit cheating tool. Because credit cheating is insane in every card game. And obviously Beriev is probably the worst credit cheating that has ever been introduced to cards. However, given enough time, maybe we'll see a card that makes Beriev cracked. The issue is, that's a very, very speculative. And in the meantime, this card is kind of terrible. The opportunity for this card to be insane, though, I will put it slightly above Tomahawk. Just because, you know, maybe somewhere down the line there's a way to make Beriev an insane part of a crucial deck in a way that I don't think Tomahawk is ever going to have. Then we have the BM, the BM7, I want to say. But the BM, it's an artillery 3 cost 2/2 blitz artillery 1 operation cost with the text, when it is attacked, instead retreat it. So basically combat doesn't happen, but it still counts as the unit attacking. So it can't attack again, but it doesn't take any damage, and this card just goes back to your hand. Now, I believe this came out the expansion before suppression, so there was a brief window where you couldn't suppress this. Nowadays, you can just suppress it if you want to get rid of it really easily, but of course it dies to anything that does 2 damage to units without attacking it. So it dies to deployment effects, it dies to AoEs, it dies to targeted removal, etc. To countermeasures. But it's just a really good card. It's nothing too insane, but just a Blitz Artillery is just really, really good. 2 damage anywhere on the board. For 4 credits is good, and sometimes it's going to give you the ability to just generate value against somebody who can't remove it, or maybe force them to use a stronger piece of removal onto a relatively low-impact unit relatively early on into the game. I see a lot of people misplay with the BM, though, where they just keep playing it because they see it as like, oh, this is an artillery which gives me infinite value because my opponent can't remove it, so I'm just going to keep spending my credits on this over and over and over and dealing 2 free damage. The issue with that is a lot of decks can just very quickly out-tempo you, where you're spending 4 credits every turn to deal 2 damage, and they're spending like 1 credit every turn to retreat the BM, and then all of their other credits are playing way more than 2 health worth of units on the board, or dealing way more than 2 damage to your HQ, and you're just going to fall behind really, really quickly. However, this can just be used, like, stuck behind guard, or against a deck that might just struggle to be able to attack this very easily, especially something like Frontline, it can be very good, or just played later in the game, it can be very good. Against Control, which doesn't have a lot of cheap units, it can be very good. The point I'm trying to get across is there's a lot of situations where this is a very good card. However, this is not as insane as a lot of people thought that it might turn out to be, but I do think it is still a solidly A-tier card. Definitely one of the better cards to have come out for Soviets recently. And then we have Depths of Winter, and yeah, this is going into S tier. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. I've talked about it enough already in this video. Depths of Winter is the best board clear in the entire game by a fairly large margin. It says remove all units from the board for both players and replace them with light infantry, which is the 1/1 tokens infantry. And unlike Monastyr, Depths of Winter says remove, not destroy and replace, so it does not trigger destruction effects, which is even better. It's substantially better. Now, obviously, there's like a niche situation where you, as the Soviet player, are maybe playing like a tokens deck and then can use your tokens. That doesn't really come up. But most of the time, you just play this because they're 1/1s, and maybe you can buy this with the Winter Warfare for 6 credits and remove everything, just a full board wipe. But oftentimes you don't really care about the light infantry. Like, you play Depths of Winter and then you play an Armored Trainer. You play Depths of Winter and then you play like a Glamour Boys or whatever. You sickle one of the light infantry in the front line. You don't really have to remove anything. You just want Depths of Winter. It is such a powerful board reset. It's one of the reasons that the matchup into Soviet Air is no longer just completely dead lost. And it's a card that, did I say Soviet Air? Brit Air. It's a card that the Brit Air players have to play around, or just any player against Soviet control, or most Soviet decks, to be honest. You have to really play around it, because even if it is a symmetrical board wipe, or board reset, it does. It's just so powerful, and because you can play it and then play units, it really forces you to always evaluate, am I putting too much on the board? Or is there enough on his board where I sort of even out if he plays Depths of Winter, removing my stuff, but he also removes his stuff? And because it's so easy to just overcommit, and then they play Depths of Winter, and you think you can come back, but you really can't come back because you just put slightly too many resources on the board that got turned into 1/1s, and then it is over. It's also huge in the mirror because, you know, stuff like Stalin's, like the 272nd, getting on the board. Obviously, with front formation, turning the mirror into who plays front formation first and away from who can build a scary board. Depths of Winter becomes slightly less useful in the mirror specifically, but it is still an absolutely insane card. And honestly might be the best card. It's really up there with 39th. 39th is a crazy, crazy card. But, man, Depths of Winter is just never a bad card. Like, it's just so good. Then we have Corson. And Corson is, of course, a 6-cost 5/7 guard that costs 1 less for every unit on your board. And at first, I didn't think this card was going to be that good. I thought there was a very good chance that it saw play. I was like, this is like a 6-cost 5/7 guard is good. In Soviets, you would play Grenadier's Guard, which is a 6-cost 5/9 guard. And if you have any unit on board, this is a 5-cost 5/7 guard, which you absolutely, that's an Osaka regiment, you would absolutely, that's actually a better Osaka regiment, you would absolutely play that in Soviet control. And if you play this with 2 units on board for 4 costs, it's insane. And I thought this was going to be a good card. I definitely underestimated how frequently, or how easy it is to just have 2 or 3 units on the board in even, like, Soviet control. And obviously, if you play something like artillery or Soviet air or like any other deck, like self-damage, any aggressive decks, it's very easy to have like 4, 5, 6 units on the board for Corson. But even just Soviet control, so many times it's very easy to play Corson for 4 or for 3. And yeah, it's just an incredibly powerful card. It's credit cheating. You're just playing a big statted guard unit for less credits than other big statted guard units cost. There's not a whole lot to Corson, to be completely honest. It's just a very straightforward, really good card. And I'm going to put it up here high into A tier because just cheap cards are good. And last but not least, we have Gambit. Easily one of my favorite cards in the game. And Gambit says both players add the biggest unit from their hand into their support lines. And the name is fitting, like the flavor on this card is awesome. And what I absolutely love about this card is it's a form of hand disruption that isn't discard. It's random in the fact that when you as the Gambit player are playing it, you don't know if your opponent has like the big card in their hand yet. Or maybe they have a card that a big scary card that you don't want to pull from their hand, but you don't think about it. Or maybe you're targeting like a Leopold, but then they have like a tiger in their hand that they pull out instead that they got off like an Africa Corps, or something like that. It can be a very disruptive card in a way that is big brain for both players. And I really like that about the card. It's also just supports my favorite way of playing Soviet control, which is to like just have answers for their threats. And Gambit is really, really good because it lets you pull out their threats in a situation where you are ready to answer it, and also potentially pull out their threats before their threat has a chance of being the most threatening. So if it pulls out like a blitz unit, if it pulls out a B-24D, you can kill it before it can attack. Or maybe it pulls out a Leopold and you kill it before it gets its deployment effect. Very, very flavorful card. And I've talked about it at length in other videos that I really, really love this card. I've brought it to an OCC before, several OCCs before. I think I won an OCC with Gambit. I'm not positive about that. I've definitely lost an OCC with Gambit before, don't get me wrong. I really like this card. With all that being said, it is not an A tier card. It is not an S tier card. It's not even a B tier card, which saddens me deeply. I think I have to put it down into C tier. At 5 cost, it's just too much for a random effect. So we see like a 5 cost disruption in something like Wolfpack. And and that saw a ton of play for a very long time. But Wolfpack is a much better card than Gambit, and it's weird, because Wolfpack says random on it. They discard a random card. So, you know, sometimes Wolfpack, like, discards, like a I don't know, like a Bloody Sickle, or an 845th, or like a Sudden Strike, and Wolfpack does absolutely nothing. But what Wolfpack always does is it always discards a card, and it used to always prevent a draw, and now it always retreats to something, and that has an impact on the board. The issue with Gambit, and particularly on ladder, is you have no idea what's in your opponent's deck. You don't know if they just have, like, they're randomly running King Tiger in their deck, or they're randomly running Super Fortress in their deck, because they felt like it. And you play Gambit, and it pulls the Super Fortress, and you lose the game on the spot immediately. Now, it gets much better in a open deck list tournament, even a closed deck list tournament, but just a tournament where you're confident you're going to be playing against good players. Gambit gets a lot better. However, it's still difficult to get into a situation where you are comfortable dealing with whatever they are going to summon in a spot where you are not like already winning the game by a lot. And also the nature of Soviet cards, because it pulls it for both players, the nature of Soviet cards is a lot of them you kind of, like, you know, you're not super happy with pulling it off of a Gambit, is more my point. Like, you know, like, it makes running ISU impossible, because ISU will always be the most expensive card in your deck, and that is obviously a deployment effect that you want to trigger. And if you're running the 272nd Guards, you want to already have the way to proc it, like with a red dot or a stand together or whatever you're doing with it. And that adds even more inconsistency to the card, because then you have to wait until you have 272nd and the other card in your hand to play the Gambit, and then, like, if you try to wait until you have a perfect hand to Gambit yourself, but then you also have to be playing around when you want to try to disrupt your opponent with your Gambit, and when you're going to be able to answer your opponent with the Gambit, it just becomes a very, very difficult card to use correctly. That being said, it's still probably my favorite card in the game, just from, like, a purely design point of view, flavor point of view, from a playing with it point of view. I think it's a very big brain card for both players. If you have Gambit in your deck, if you know your opponent has Gambit in their deck, it changes the way you play the game entirely. Like, maybe you develop big cards specifically because you're like, they're not going to expect this off of the Gambit. Like, maybe you don't play your expensive card on the turn you can play it, because you're like, well, maybe my opponent will pull it from my hand for cheaper, so I'm going to focus on going, like, wider. Stuff like that. Gambit just has so many interesting play patterns. If only it didn't cost 5. Because 5 credits is way too much to play a card that might put you in a worse position. If this costs, like, 3, maybe you'd play it. The issue is that it pulls from both players, and if this cost 3, then you would build your deck around getting Gambit and, like, a Stalin in your hand at the same time on turn 3, so you can pull out a Stalin and then win the game, and that becomes incredibly unfun and incredibly unintelligent gameplay. So yeah, I really love the effect of Gambit, but it is just a situational and weak card that is going to be going down here into C tier. Where exactly in C tier? Hard to say. I think it's probably worse than Siberian Transfer, because of the Siberian Transfer is slightly better. I think it's probably better than Stalin, in that I do think the nature of Soviet control disruption is almost always better than more value in your deck. Because Soviets are already the kings of value, especially with front formation. So just disruption is really good. Also, Soviets are by far the weakest control class to OTK decks, and Gambit has a decent ability to disrupt OTK decks if there's any units involved in that deck at all. So even if it's not going to be a meta staple card of Soviet control, I still, deep in my heart, it's one of Soviet's only ways of hand disruption. And I really love that for them. But anyways, this is my tier list. Again, it is not a crafting guide. But yeah, I talked about all the cards, talked a little bit about their history, about how to play with them. I hope you enjoyed that. If you liked hearing more about the cards rather than just simply, this card is good, this card is bad, let me know. Or if you'd rather the next ones to be a bit more shorter, obviously talking about every card and its history, that adds a lot to the video. Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below or in my Discord, which you can join with the link. Also, let me know what you think about my ratings. Do you think I have cards too high? Do you think I have cards too low? Do you think I missed something big? Or do you simply agree with me? Feel free to tell me that as well. All of that in the comments down below or in my Discord. Subscribe so you don't miss the 2 remaining Cards Elites tier list, as well as future content, which I am planning on producing. I know it's been a long time, a lot of gaps between videos, but, you know, that's just life at the moment. But I can promise you that there will be more videos. So subscribe if you don't want to miss them. And, you know, feel free to donate if you have the means and the desire to do so. That link is in the description as well. And thank you very much to everybody who has donated. It does help out a lot, and it definitely does encourage me to come and do these videos. But with that being said, I'm going to be completing the Cards Elites tier list at some point. It probably won't be my next video. My next video, I would like to get some good old-fashioned just cards gameplay. So if you also have any ideas of what cards gameplay you want, feel free to leave that in the comments on this video, or there is a suggestions slash feedback channel in my Discord, so you can feel free to go there and suggest fun video ideas that you would like to see, and I will consider them over there. So with all of that being said, that is enough rambling from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch all of y'all in the next one.